As we've seen, rates of poverty in the United States are significantly higher than they are in other OECD countries. So let's now talk about how the US Census Bureau estimates poverty within the United States, and we'll focus here just on describing the data about variation among groups. And with an exception or two, we're going to save explanations about why poverty varies so much for down the road for another time. I should also note that soon enough I'm going to be arguing that the official Census Bureau measure is so deeply flawed that we probably shouldn't even use it. But because it's still the most common measure, you should be familiar with what it says. So we're going to focus on that official measure today. Okay, so here we see two line graphs, right? And the one on the bottom shows us the number of people who were officially poor by Census Bureau official measures from 1959 through to 2018, and that's the most recent year for which data are available. So as you can see here, according to the census, in 2018, there were about 38 million Americans living at or below the poverty line. It's about $24,000 for a family of four. But because the overall population changes over time, of course, we're more likely to look at how many people are poor as a percentage of the population rather than absolute numbers. And when we do that, as the chart on the top shows, we see that there are fewer people as a share of the population living in poverty in 2018 than there were in 1959. Now, notice a couple of things here. One is that poverty was declining pretty steadily in the post-war period, even before the war on poverty. And that trend continued until 1973, when poverty reached the lowest rate it has ever been in the US at 11.1%. It then climbed to about 15% in the early 80s, declined a bit, then climbed up again to about 15% in the early 90s, declined to near record lows by 2000, then it rose back up again, and now it's back down toward that lower end. So today, 12% of the population, almost 40 million people, are living at or below that official poverty line. As I said, that's about $24,000 a year gross. That's before taxes for a family of four. Now, that poverty rate is an average. It tells us what the official overall rate is in the United States, north and south and east and west, for all different age groups, for all different racial groups, and so on, everybody combined. But that average, like all averages, obscures variation, right? And as we'll see, poverty in the US varies in profound and important ways. So let's start here by looking at variation by geography. Many people think of poverty as primarily a feature of northeastern industrial cities, right? But as you can see here, poverty is actually generally higher in the South, Midwest, and West than it is in the Northeast, and this is in fact has almost always been true. But notice how much variation there is. The overall official poverty rate for 2018 was 12%, as we saw, but look at Mississippi, it's 20%. And now look at the other end of the spectrum, New Hampshire, just under 8%. So that overall rate of 12% obscures lots of variation from state to state. The rate in Mississippi is almost 3 times as high as the rate in New Hampshire. Now, even though state poverty rates are averages, of course, right, showing us the poverty rates of all of the parts of the state combined, but that obscures variation too, and that's what this county by county view shows us, and this is looking at 2017 data. So look at Mississippi and Alabama, where we can find counties with the nation's highest poverty rates right next to counties with some of the lowest poverty rates. Note also here that some other patterns start to emerge. See the concentrated poverty in West Virginia and Kentucky and Appalachia. Notice the high poverty of certain areas of the southern border in the Southwest, where low-wage immigrant workers tend to be found. And then note also the high poverty regions of the Northern Plains, where we find Native American reservations. There's poverty just about everywhere in the United States, but it's more prevalent and more concentrated in some places. Now this shows us what's often called persistent poverty, that is, areas that are not just poor today, but have been very poor in every decennial census every 10 years since 1980. So do you notice a familiar pattern? And this is, again, where those areas of concentrated poverty tend to be. Notice how important a role the South plays, and notice how this pattern is least terrible in the Northeast. And here's that same breakdown for the last 2 years for which we have data. So that's one pattern that tends to surprise people. Poverty is highest in the South. Here's another. Poverty is actually higher outside of metropolitan areas than it is within them. That's not, of course, to suggest that there's not lots and lots of poverty in big cities, but simply that it's more consistently higher elsewhere. And even within those metropolitan areas, there's a lot of variation. So you can hit pause and examine this table and look at the poverty rates for 2017 and compare Detroit, Michigan to Washington, D.C. What do you find? This is that same thing in visual form. Again, the point here is the sheer scale of variation from place to place. This is using 2015 data, showing us the variation just across the top metropolitan areas within California, and that's in yellow here, ranging from rates of 8% all the way up to 32%. And again, that's metropolitan areas within the same state. And this is now looking at New Hampshire counties rather than metropolitan areas. And notice that the poverty rate for Coos is almost 3 times as high as the rate for Rockingham. So while it is true that New Hampshire has the lowest overall poverty rate of any state, that does not mean that there are not places here with lots of poor people. And now look at that variation in Manchester, which is New Hampshire's largest city, from a low of 5% or less to as high as 30% or more, depending on where you live, even within the same city. Now, how much do you know about how much variation there is within your own town or city? So here's one way to find that out. If you follow that link in red, or just go to US Census Fact Finder or Google US Census Fact Finder, you'll be able to plug in your zip code and it will show you, right? Or plug in the city name and it will show you variation across that region. So finally, there's one more important point about the geography of poverty, to make for now, and that's the suburbanization of poverty. This is now a trend nationwide. In fact, the fastest growing areas of poverty in the United States are the suburbs. Think about what this might mean for service delivery, say. How might getting food and services be different if most poor people live in suburbs rather than in central cities? So, that's one kind of variation, the ways in which poverty varies by place, by region of the country, by state and county, by metropolitan areas, within metropolitan regions, and within and across cities. Let's turn to another way in which poverty varies in the United States, and that is by age. So look at the data on the far right. So while the overall 2018 poverty rate was 12%, varies a lot by age. Substantially lower for people over 65 at 10%, but higher for children under 18 at 16%. Look at that trend over time. We've gone from a world in which people over 65 had the highest poverty of any age group in 1959 to today when they have the lowest poverty rate for any age group. So what happened? We'll talk about this at some length at another time, but the short answer to what happened is Social Security is what happened. It's a bit more complicated than that, but it's not much more complicated than that. It turns out that when you send people money every month, they have more income and they are less poor. That sounds flip, I know, but I don't mean it to be. Sometimes we mystify poverty, I think. We talk about how hard it is to solve, how puzzling it is, how the poor ye shall always have with you, and so on. But as a policy matter, it is not actually that hard. How do you make people less poor? See that they have more money. And that's the lesson of Social Security here and what's happened to poverty for people over the age of 65. Now that said, even though those over 65 have the lowest poverty rate in the US, at least by the official measure anyway, our rates of poverty among older people are nonetheless very high compared to other OECD countries. So now this is homing in on children under the age of 18, again using 2017 data, and that's also a reminder about variation across states. Yet again, right, even within those states, averages obscure variation within them. You should be seeing some very familiar patterns now, too. So we saw earlier overall areas of persistent poverty, right? So here's now looking at places that tend to have persistent child poverty. And this matters, again, as we'll talk about down the road, since it seems likely that the causes and the solutions for long-term persistent poverty may be different than the causes and solutions for short-term periodic poverty. But of course, children, right? Even that can be a broad category. And there might be important variations even within that group. Take a look. What do you see here? And again, by way of reminder, as with other indicators, our rates of poverty among children are also high compared with other OECD nations. All right, so now let's look at variation in poverty rates by race. As you can see here, poverty rates for African Americans and Hispanic Americans are more than twice the rate for whites. These are long-standing, persistent patterns, although it's important to note that progress has nonetheless been made. And you can see that here, especially when looking at declines in African American poverty since 1959. But even those racial categories are fairly arbitrary constructions and averages of very different groups. So here's the Census Bureau's Hispanic category, breaking down poverty by country of origin. This is for the year 2010. So once again, we see lots of variation with poverty rates of 30% for people from Guatemala, but 8% for people from Peru. But even that's only telling us part of the story. So there's variation by racial or ethnic subgroup by geography too, which as you see here, wildly different poverty rates for Dominicans depending on where they live. This is a similar kind of breakdown for Asian American populations. One of the important lessons to take away from all of this is that if you are ever asked to gather data on poverty for a grant proposal or a needs assessment or a research project, think very carefully about what is the most relevant bit of data, given how widespread the differences are. And finally, in this category, citizenship status matters too, but it may matter in a surprising kind of way. So take a minute to look at this. Is there anything you see that's unexpected? Why do you think that poverty rates for foreign-born naturalized citizens are lower than for native-born Americans? So, we've seen that while the overall poverty rate in the US most recently was about 12%, that obscures a lot of variation. We know that it's generally higher in the South than in the Northeast and outside of metropolitan areas than within them, although there's a lot of variation between metro areas too and within them as well. It's about 16% for children, but 10% for the elderly by official measures, and 18% for Hispanic Americans, 21% for African Americans. Poverty rates also vary by gender and by family structure. So even though the gap is closing, poverty has historically been higher among women than among men. And of course, these rates vary not just by gender, but by gender and geography as well. And by gender and age. So here's that difference for 2 different years broken down by age. For every age group, women are poorer than men by as much as 3.5 percentage points for working age adult women, and nearly that for those over the age of 65. Poverty among women varies significantly by race, too, with Native women having the highest poverty rates and white non-Hispanic women the lowest. And this is that same variation looking just at women over the age of 65. It's not just by gender, of course. Poverty varies by family structure, with poverty among female-headed families more than twice the overall poverty rate at 25%. Now, much of this is the product of having only one wage earner in the household, right? Coupled with not having another adult to share childcare responsibilities with. And again, we're going to talk about this at some length down the road, how we explain variation in poverty by family structure and gender. And of course, this variation by family structure is compounded when we factor in race, and you should expect that now. Here's the pattern today, or for 2018, our most recent data year. Now take a look at this. What do you notice here? The married couple poverty rates in the United States is higher than the single mother rate in Finland, Norway, and Sweden. Only in the United States is there this deep correlation between marital status and poverty, something maybe to throw in the back of your head when we try to think about explanations. Finally, in this category, poverty may well vary by sexual orientation too, although I think we should be really cautious about these data, especially simply because it's so recent that we've gathered data on this at all, and people may still be pretty reluctant to answer these kinds of questions honestly. But that said, take a look at the section marked by the arrow. So why do you think same-sex male couples have the lowest overall poverty rates while same-sex female couples have the highest poverty rates, with different sex couples there in the middle? So here's my guess. It has nothing to do with sexual orientation, but it's all about gender. We know that women earn less than men. Thus, couples with two women in them face the most labor market discrimination. Couples with two men in them face the least labor market discrimination. And couples with one woman and one man are, again, in the middle. Now, only time is going to tell whether I'm right on this hypothesis. But I do think that there's no reason to expect that we would see variation by orientation per se. Now, this is looking at the intersection of race and sexual orientation. And again, you should be able to reasonably predict outcomes when we start to layer these factors on top of each other. So, look at this. Can you now fill in the most recent poverty rates for each of these groups? And finally, this is looking now just at the population of people who are officially poor, right? So it's not looking at the entire population, but this is just poor people. As you can see, the single largest group of poor people in the US are children. Notice how few able-bodied adults are among their number, by the way, and this is, again, something else that we are going to return to.